Hi, welcome back to my channel. My name is April and this is High Fantasy Writing. This video is going to be a continuation of my critiquing series, and in this video I'm going to go over more specifics on how to be a courteous critique partner. Now, many of these things may seem extremely obvious. People, generally speaking, know how to be kind and courteous in everyday conversations, but when you're engaging in a sort of transaction that is critique work, some different things come into play when you want to be both courteous, but also a critique is by nature you telling somebody what they're doing wrong. At least that's a part of it, is letting somebody know that you're not doing this thing correctly. So sometimes that can be very hard to navigate for people who don't really know how to come across as being kind, but also helpful and firm in the, here is what I'm seeing, this needs to be changed. So being a courteous critique partner is extremely important in building that bond with your critique partner when you want to make this a lasting thing. You want them to be looking at your entire manuscript, and you want the entire interaction to be courteous, constructive, and both parties feeling like it's a good thing when they get their critique back. They want to be excited to get their critique and not dreading it and wondering every single day, should I cancel this critiquing partnership? Another aspect to keep in mind is that if you are a courteous critique partner, the person whose work you're critiquing is more likely to follow your advice. They're more likely to not be as defensive about their work and more open to hearing what you have to say when you say it and phrase it in a more courteous manner. Or if just in your general interactions with your critiquing partner, even not having anything to do with the manuscript, just saying, greeting them or thanking them for thinking of you to be a critique partner, just a basic kindness, courtesy, being a generally welcoming and kind person is definitely going to help that bond you have with the person whose manuscript you're reading. Because handing over a manuscript is it can be very sensitive because people have put hours and hours of work into this. This is their literal creation and they're handing it over to you. And they need to be able to trust that you're going to be kind and not cruel with your critiques. Now, if your critique partner doesn't trust you, they don't have that rapport with you that you are supposed to be building up, then they might discount many of your critiques. And so both of you are just wasting your time. You are putting all this time and effort into reading their manuscript and commenting on it and sending it back, and they're not even paying attention to what you're saying because maybe the way you said it or your interactions outside of the critique have led them to not give your words very much credence. So both you and the person whose manuscript you're reading are just wasting your time and effort, and that's a waste. It's just a waste. Now, if there is an exchange of manuscripts, this can escalate to ridiculous proportions. So if one critique partner feels like the other has been rude in their critique, they might decide to be even ruder in their critique, and then the other partner might be even ruder in their next critique, and it's not constructive criticism anymore. It's you were awful to me in my work, so I'm gonna be awful to you in yours. And so just nipping that in the bud, being as courteous as possible and putting your own ego aside and saying, okay, we need to be kind to the person who we are critiquing their work can go a long way in creating great partnerships that last for perhaps years and getting the most out of each critique, where every single comment is well thought out and carefully constructed to not just be rude in the critique, but rather be as constructive and helping the other person as possible. That was terribly phrased, but you know what I mean. Now, once you have gotten a rapport with your critique partner, say you're already on chapter 5 and you and the critique partner have talked at length about the manuscript, then you can begin to feel out the social situation, feel out how they respond to criticism, feel out how comfortable they are with you being perhaps harsher and not having to do the sandwich method. Because when you're first handing off your critique, and say it's the first chapter, if all you receive back are very harsh, telling it like it is, brutally honest critiques, the author might sit there and think, this person hates my story is complete trash. They don't want to keep reading, all they have to say is negative, awful things about it. So when you first begin your critiques, I find it's more helpful to be much, much more gentle and kind, really doing the sandwich method and highlighting the things that you love about the story, explicitly telling them that you want to keep reading. But once you get to like chapter 5, you can start to reel that back because you and your critique partner have developed a rapport. Your critique partner knows that you like this story. They know that you're in it for the long haul. They know that you want to keep reading and you're invested in the plot and in the characters. They're less concerned when they read a critical comment that you're just wanting to drop the entire book and think the entire premise is stupid. They're more likely, because you've gotten this rapport, to be okay with a bit harsher comments, or comments that aren't layered with as many compliments. Once you've gotten a rapport, you can also be much more specific with your comments. So you're already getting a feel for the characters. In like chapter 1, if you tell them, oh, this character wouldn't be saying something like that, you don't actually know as the critique partner that they wouldn't, because you don't know this character yet. But once you're at, say, chapter 20, then you can let them know, hey, the character that you have built up for 20 chapters, this bit of dialogue feels out of place. And you're able to say that because you do know this character. You have gotten to know the story, the themes, the general feel of the world. So those types of very specific comments mean a lot more coming later, after you've developed a rapport with your critique partner and a rapport with the manuscript itself, than if you said them in the very first chapter. Now, stepping away from the actual content of your critiques, a great way to be a courteous critique partner is to read your partner's work in a reasonable amount of time. This is number one, generally courteous, so that the person who is waiting for the manuscript back isn't waiting for months and months for a single chapter, because if they're at the point where they're asking for critique partners, they want to get that feedback so they can continue writing their story. They're kind of at a standstill until you get back to them with what you think about the story, because they already know what they think. But the point of a critique partner is to see what somebody else thinks. And if you never let them know what you think for months at a time, that's just terrible to do to an author who is waiting to see what you think of the work so that they can fix things and then go to an editor, then go to a publisher. You're completely stalling their process, completely taking the author out of the situation. You need to read the manuscript in a reasonable amount of time, because if you take long breaks between chapters or scenes, you are going to forget what's going on in the story. I can't tell you how many times I have received chapters back, because I usually send it one chapter at a time. I have received chapters back months after the previous chapter, and the person is asking questions that were answered in the previous chapter. Now, when you do this and when you tell the author this section isn't clear, you need to make it clear in this chapter, the author begins to question whether or not they were too vague in their descriptions of chapters prior. And they might start getting very heavy-handed with either backstories, world building, character development, foreshadowing, because you took so long to get back to them that you couldn't remember that, oh, yeah, that thing was foreshadowed 6 chapters ago, but I read that chapter a year ago, so I don't remember. And that's not helpful for anybody, because I feel like a lot of issues that come up in books is the author, they know the story. They know what's going to happen. They know all the backstories. The reader doesn't. So as authors, a lot of times we fall into the trap of thinking that our readers know our story as much as we do. And if a critique partner tells you, I'm not getting this, I don't get why this character is acting this way, if you had hinted at something in their past as to why they behave a certain way, and then the reader sees the special behavior, and they mention it, and they're like, I don't get why they're doing this, but you explained why they did this 3 chapters ago, you might think as an author, oh my goodness, I wasn't clear enough, I need to reiterate it, and then you get reviews saying, oh, the author doesn't trust the reader to be able to think for themselves, they have to spoon feed everything to the reader. And I have found that getting critiques back from people who spent months at a time between chapters, those are mainly the critiques I get back to encourage me to spoon feed my readers, to encourage me to be heavy-handed with the themes and the backstories and the foreshadowing, because they just didn't remember, because they didn't take the time to get the critiques back in a reasonable amount of time. Another issue you run into when you take so much time between chapters is you cut up the flow of the story. Story flow and pacing are extremely important, and if you're only reading a chapter at a time, a chapter a month, you're not getting the flow of the story. You don't feel the pacing, because if chapter 1 is super action-packed, and then 2 and 3 are a little bit slower, and then chapter 4 has a lot of action in it again, you're gonna feel like, oh, it's been 3-4 months since we've even seen any action. This story is so slow-paced. When really it was only 2 chapters of lower action, but your view of it is shifted because you're taking so long, so you don't actually get the flow of the story. So making sure that you actually get your critique partner's work back in a reasonable amount of time is extremely important in the courtesy aspect, being courteous to your critique partner, because it, number one, helps you with your critiques, and it helps the author know that you actually care about the story. You're not just, this is the lowest thing on my priority list, and it helps you give better critiques that the author is going to be able to use, and not giving the author terrible advice. Now, the last thing I want to talk about with being a courteous critique partner is authorial intent. So there has been a trend I have found, mostly lately, about critiquing authors about the social implications of their work. So if they feel like the author is promoting a problematic thing in their book, or if the author didn't address a certain problematic thing, say they're writing about a contemporary and there are people of color in it. Some people might get upset if the author never really addresses the issues that people of color face in the real world. Now, the author might have just done this ignorantly. They might be trying to ignore the issues that people face in the real world, or they just might not have felt that they were the right person to speak out on that, and that wasn't really the point of their story, so they decided to leave it out. Now, when you're critiquing somebody's work and you feel like something problematic is included in the work, absolutely you can let them know. You can let them know, hey, this section is coming off like this for me, and you could run into some issues if people think that that is your view of the issue. But keep in mind that authors cannot address every single thing in a work of fiction. So they can't go into the nuance of every single side of an issue, especially if that's not even what their story is about. So try in your critiques to keep in mind what you feel the author's true intent for the story is and judge it based on that, instead of saying, well, I wish you had included this. Your story is problematic because you didn't include this, or you showed this side of an issue but not this side, or the 15 other sides of the issue. You can absolutely bring it up to them and say, I would have liked to see more sides of this issue, but always keep in mind that that might not be the point of the story. The point of the story might not be to critique the criminal justice system if they're writing a missing persons thriller. Their goal might be more internal about the family member of the person who has gone missing and their experience trying to find the kidnapper. They might not focus too much on the actual law enforcement side of things, and that's okay. It's okay that they didn't address the issues in law enforcement and missing persons cases. That wasn't their intent with the story. And so you can feel like, hey, I would love to see a story that focuses on that, but don't be rude and tell the author that, hey, you're doing something wrong because you didn't address it the way I wanted you to. No author is going to be able to put on page your personal political ideology in all of its intricacies that are unique to you. Even people who are of one political or social political viewpoint aren't going to feel the same about issues. So expecting an author to read your mind and have written a story specifically that tailors to every single thing you believe, it's just unrealistic, and you need to be able to separate yourself from the work and say, what is the larger point of this? But again, if there's something that's super problematic, go ahead and let them know. Let them know, like, hey, I see that you have written a story about, I don't know, a hospital, and you never mention the issues with insurance and patients not being able to get care because of they lack insurance. I feel like that is a very large part of working in a hospital, and being in the healthcare industry is that type of stuff comes up, but you've completely ignored it in your book. I would have liked to see more of that. Just add another layer of realism to your book. The author might say, oh, that's a really great subplot to add in, or some extra realism to add in so that people can really see the struggles that doctors and people trying to get care face. But they also might say, that is an important issue, but my book is really about this romance between a doctor in this section of the hospital and a doctor in that section of the hospital. I wasn't really setting out to make a commentary about the healthcare industry in whatever country they happen to have set the story. I use an example from the American healthcare system, but everybody's healthcare system is going to be different. It's going to have different issues. That was just an example of very, very real, very important issues. But maybe that wasn't the author's intent to address those issues, and it's okay. So attacking an author in a critique or a review isn't really helpful, and it's kind of just attacking people to attack them rather than addressing the real issue that's actually out there in the world that we need to address. Another thing to remember is that the author might write about viewpoints that they don't agree with. An issue has come up like sort of a couple of weeks ago, or maybe a month ago, I don't know, where a YouTuber, Daniel Green, published his book, and people criticized him saying that he was glorifying the police and it was police propaganda in his book because all three of his main characters were detectives in a fantasy world, and they had very specific viewpoints. Now Daniel has come out and he said that he enjoys writing characters who he does not agree with, and that his intent was not to glorify a police state, but rather tell the story of these three detectives. I haven't personally read it, his book. I'm just going off of what I've heard about it and the issues that people have raised. And so I wanted to use that as an example to say that just because an author writes from a certain point of view or writes characters with a certain point of view doesn't mean that they believe that thing. Doesn't mean they have that same point of view. Authors write from many different points of view, and sometimes authors write from points of view that there is no one character who is actually right or even good. There's a whole host of characters who are very gray in morality. And as a critiquer, you should always take a step back and think, okay, is the larger world saying that this is accurate in the case, or is it just this one character in this story who is feeling that way, who is behaving that way, who has this worldview? Is this really the author being a self-insert and saying this is the worldview you should believe? Or is it just, in a host of characters, there is this one who believes these things, but there are other characters who believe other things, and other characters who believe even other things. So instead of thinking everything that's written on the page is the worldview of the author, perhaps take a step back and think about authorial intent before you give a harsh critique, because you need to think of the author as a person, not as their work. And that will definitely help you be a more courteous critique partner. So that is all for this video today. I hope that you guys really got something out of it, gave you something to think about when you're going into critiques, how to be a more courteous critique partner with the person who you're sharing manuscripts with, and I hope that it can make your experience being a critique partner filled with a lot of positive reactions rather than always feeling like you're going into a fight when you are critiquing somebody else's work. Please give a like or subscribe to my channel if you enjoyed it. Share it with anybody who you know who is getting into critiquing, or who perhaps is just getting back into critiquing and needs a little refresher on how to be a great critique partner. You can share the entire playlist I have about being a critique partner. And next time, I'm actually going to be going on the flip side and going through some things to keep in mind when receiving a critique. Most of my videos have been about giving critiques, but now I'm going to talk about how to receive a critique and take it in and not collapse because somebody is telling you that your work isn't the greatest. I do have an ambiance channel, High Fantasy Ambiance. If you wanted to check that out, it's a great, just little soothing ambiances for you to be able to put on in the background as you're working, as you're reading, as you're writing, as you're perhaps critiquing somebody else's work or editing it. Just little soothing videos for you there if you would like to check that out. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of the day, and I look forward to seeing you again. Bye!